Hello. I want to thank you all for being here, and I'm worried about being the speaker before lunch. I'm really worried about that. I'm hoping the topic will be interesting to you. How many of you actually use Timeout with the families that you work with? Can I just get a sense of that? So this should be a topic that's interesting to some of you because we're using Timeout. How many of you have had people ask you whether Timeout might traumatize a child? Okay, so we're all kind of dealing with the same kind of concerns, the same kind of questions. So that's the topic today. I'm here from Morgantown, West Virginia. My background is in parent-child interaction therapy, so you will hear me talking about PCIT quite a bit. But PCIT is just one of many evidence-based parent training programs that use Timeout. And so when I talk about PCIT, I am talking about the family of behavioral parent training programs that also use Timeout. I am going to go ahead and let you know that there are some disclosures for me that I do have a book about PCIT and do a lot of training in the model. And so I am a bit biased on PCIT because I've seen it work and I like it a lot. I also want to acknowledge one of my doctoral students, Nancy Wallace, who helped me put this presentation together. So really appreciate that. Should also acknowledge Dr. Sheila Iberg, the creator of parent-child interaction therapy. My background is that I was Sheila's first doctoral student, so that's kind of where Sheila and I got started. So I'm going to start by talking about a lot of misconceptions about Timeout. That if you look at the popular press, and so you think about things like Nanny 911 and Dr. Phil and Parents Magazines and things like that, Timeout is often oversimplified. It's made to sound so easy. Oh, instead of spanking your child, put them in a chair and it'll be okay. You'll hear pediatricians, relatives, friends, teachers all have a very naive explanation of Timeout, but Timeout is actually really complicated if you're going to do it effectively. I think about our clinic and I think of the thousands of children that I've worked with PCIT, and you will find that thousands of families have tried Timeout, and thousands of families will tell you it doesn't work for their children. And a lot of this has to do with the naivete about Timeout, that it's as simple as putting a child in a chair. But Timeout for typically behaving children is different than Timeout for children with significant behavior problems. And what a lot of the misconceptions happen from the fact that it is not explained to parents how do you actually get an aggressive child to a Timeout chair, and how do you actually keep an aggressive child in a Timeout chair. And so once you get to the point of a child who will not go or stay in a Timeout chair, it gets pretty complicated at that point. So a lot of parents will just assume that Timeout is ineffective, and they'll have a negative view of Timeout. In PCIT, we actually have this rule of thumb that we never use the dirty T word, the Timeout word, until we actually get to the second phase of therapy. So we sort of dangle for the parents this vague idea that parent-child interaction therapy is a two-phase program. And the first phase is relationship enhancement, and that's called CDI, child-directed interaction. And then the second phase is a discipline program focused on compliance training called parent-directed interaction. And we will dangle for the parents the compliance training part because it's really exciting, because the children go from under 30% compliant, like 3 out of 10 things they're told to do will they listen to, and they go to over 70% compliant at the end of PCIT. So when we start the discipline phase, we can let a parent know that we're going to get really fast improvements in the child's compliant behavior, and that we'll see it very quickly when we start the discipline. But if we use the word Timeout instead of the word sort of a specialized discipline procedure, if we say Timeout too early in therapy, we could actually lose a parent over it because they've had such bad experiences with Timeout and they really don't believe in it. let me tell you some reasons why they don't believe in timeout. If you look, like I just did a search, an internet search on child timeout, and the first thing that comes up is all the terrible things and how timeouts hurt children. So that's the first thing that pops up on an internet search. And so that concerns me because we have, for decades, we have been doing scientific research on timeout, and we have demonstrated its effectiveness again and again and again in hundreds of studies. And the first thing that pops up is that timeout is harmful to children. A big part of this has to do, I think, with, again, misconceptions and myths about timeout. But there's this one study in the Journal of Developmental and Behavioral Pediatrics. And in this study, they actually went to all the websites to see what would happen. And they found that the chance of finding complete and accurate information about timeout by going on the internet is near zero. So internet search is not a great way to find out about timeout, and I'm worried that we're not getting our word out. We're not actually taking our science and putting it out there for the lay public to benefit. And then there was this magazine article, and this magazine article set us back quite a bit. And this magazine article was in Time magazine, and it's by Siegel and Bryson. And in this article, they talked about no drama discipline, and they talked about how timeout is going to, it involves seclusion, it involves, its isolation is actually going to affect the areas of the brain that are the same areas that are affected by physical abuse and things like that. I apologize because I can't actually see my slides. Let me see, maybe if I look this way, I'll be able to actually read them. Have other people had trouble with this, or is this just my eyes? Is this just me? I'm just like, what on earth does that say? Okay, what I could do is I could get the audience to read them out for me, and I think that would be really helpful. Okay, let's read that. In a brain scan, it says that relational pain that's caused by isolation during punishment can look the same as physical abuse, and is being alone in the corner the best place for a child? So this Time magazine article was read all over the world by millions and millions of people. Here are some quotes from the Time magazine article. I might have to let you read them. Can you all read them? Can you see them on the slides? Okay, that's wonderful. But I think you can see that in most cases, the primary experience of timeout often involves a child's isolation. It communicates to kids, I'm only interested in being with you and being there for you when you've got it all together. And timeouts are usually ineffective in accomplishing the goals of discipline to change behavior. Oh, that hurts me to the core because our science suggests just the opposite. So these quotes were in the Time magazine article. When you actually look at some of the brain work that was placed in that Time magazine article, one of the studies that's cited to support the fact that timeout is so harmful to children is a study of adults doing a virtual ball toss game and looking at their brain imaging when somebody sort of shuns them in this virtual ball toss game. The other article that was cited had to do with rats who were being weaned from their mother rat and placed in isolation for long periods of time. So this kind of miscommunication is so hurtful to the field and affects us very much. 1 month later, the scientific community came out against this article in the Time magazine, and there was a retraction that came out a month later in which the authors wrote that the appropriate use of timeout calls for brief and frequent previously explained breaks from an interaction used as part of a thought out parenting strategies followed by positive feedback and connection with a parent, and that this seems not only reasonable but is an overall approach supported by the research as helpful for many children. Despite this retraction, very few people actually read a retraction, but a lot of people read the article. And so our own Dr. John Comer saw that this was a problem, and he asked if my colleagues and I might write our own article, really kind of looking at the myths associated with timeout. So we wrote this article, weighing in on the timeout controversy, an empirical perspective. So we really wanted to take a scientific look at timeout and whether this is harmful to children. So this is one of my doctoral students, Lauren Quetch, and I also did this with Nancy Wallace and Dr. Amy Herschel, all at West Virginia University. And we kind of went through myth by myth, trying to debunk some of those myths about timeout and the idea that timeout is somehow harmful to children. But I have to say that it gets even more complicated. If you think about it, here we go, people are worrying whether timeout just for every toddler in America is dangerous and hurting their brains and causing them to have the same experience as physical abuse. But we also have the issue of children who have experienced trauma. So it's just incredibly fortunate that Dr. Monorino talked before this presentation because I think he set the stage really well to talk about this question, which is, should timeouts be used with children who have trauma histories? And I'll tell you, I think about this quite a bit, and that's why I'm here talking about it, because this is one of those things that wakes me up in the middle of the night, is worrying about whether it is ethical and appropriate to take a child with a trauma history and to send them through a potentially stressful timeout procedure and compliance training procedure. Trauma therapists have expressed to me, and I bet you they've expressed to you as well, grave concerns about using timeout for children who have a history of maltreatment. There is worry, and this is worry that I've had as well, that timeout could somehow trigger a trauma reaction. And that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? If you're a child and you were horribly harmed in a disciplined situation, and you have a therapist who is going to put you into disciplined situations, can that then trigger a trauma response from these children? And it's certainly something to think about and reflect on, and we're going to reflect on it in this hour. And could timeout re-traumatize children who have these very negative histories in these discipline scenarios and other situations? It's interesting because PCIT has been endorsed as a best practice for child trauma, and timeout is a critical component of PCIT. So what's going on there in terms of that confusion? It would also help me to have a show of hands to find out if any of you have had this question posed to you, whether it is appropriate and ethical to use timeout with a child with a trauma history for the fear of re-triggering and traumatizing. Can I see a show of hands of whether people have had that concern raised? Okay. So this is a concern that I hear quite a bit, and let's just flesh it out and put it on the table and talk about it a little bit. When you look at places like the Kaufman Best Practices Report, and you look at the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, PCIT specifically and behavioral parent training are considered to be best practices for child trauma. So here's a page from the Kaufman report that points to 3 best practices for trauma: TF-CBT, AF-CBT, and PCIT. If you look at the common characteristics, there's some between TF-CBT and AF-CBT. They look more similar in some ways because you're working in psychoed, and there's some work on emotional expression, there's work on some cognitive restructuring, and there's some exposure in there. But then you look at PCIT and you're like, really? Like that's really different to think about PCIT as a trauma intervention, because PCIT does have this pretty intensive discipline component that is focused on compliance training with children. And it involves all this coaching of the parents and teaching them the play therapy pride skills, all that relationship work. So it's sort of like, how did PCIT get in that mix with these other very classic, I think if somebody said, what would be a classic trauma treatment, you would build TFCBT, right? You wouldn't build giving commands, to having a parent give a command to a child, give a warning statement and pick them up and put them in a timeout chair. That probably wouldn't be your first thing to think of for a trauma treatment for children. So I just want to talk a little bit about whether we're doing the most appropriate thing, how did PCIT get listed as a trauma treatment, and where are we going from here? That brings me to Australia and the Gold Coast of Australia, obviously. Go with me. Go with me to the Gold Coast of Australia for a minute. Those are my children on the surfboard there. So I was at SeaWorld with my children on the Gold Coast of Australia, and I promised my children I would not work while I was there. We were doing SeaWorld, we're doing sea lions, we're doing the fish, and I had worked a lot, doing a lot of training on that side of the world. And I got these persistent emails from a group on the Gold Coast of Australia saying, "We heard you're in Australia, can we talk to you?" And I said, "I'm at SeaWorld with my family, I'm sorry, maybe you could email me the question." They said, "No, we need to talk to you in person. Can we just have like an hour of your time?" And I said, "I'm at a resort, I'm at the SeaWorld resort." And they said, "Could we just do it while your children, could we just talk while your children are in the swimming pool?" That's what they asked me. And I said, I showed the email to my children and my husband, and I said, what do you want me to do? And they said, as long as it is only while we are in the pool, and then when we get out of the pool, you promise that you won't work anymore, and we can do it. So what had happened was that there was a PCIT program at this center, and it's a trauma-informed center. And the trauma therapist did not understand at all what was going on with the PCIT therapists. And a bit of a divide, you might even call it a war, was going on in the clinic because the PCIT therapists were coaching discipline sessions, and the children with trauma histories were screaming in the timeout chair. They were seeming out of control. People were coming in to check on the PCIT therapists. Are you okay? But most importantly, is that child okay? And what are you doing? Should we call the police? Why are you doing what you are doing? And so the left hand really didn't know what the right hand was doing. And the PCIT therapists who had been trained in the model but were relatively new to the model, they didn't know what to say to the trauma-informed therapists as to why they're doing what they're doing. And here's some of the questions that they brought to SeaWorld. First, is it ethical to put a young child in a backup room who may have had a history of being locked in closets or left for long periods of time? As you know, we don't know these histories. We know just a small percentage of what has happened to a child in foster care. We don't know. They could have been neglected. They could have been locked in closets. They could have been left for long periods of time. And in the PCIT model, I should go over it just a little bit for those of you who may not be as familiar with it. The child would be, first of all, they would get play therapy, so they would get this special play time where the parent would be working on their relationship with the child. And basically that's like positive behavior support, that we would set the child up for really good behavior, and we would be working on social skills and self-esteem and all kinds of wonderful, positive, wonderful things. And then the second half of the program is the discipline phase, where we do focus on compliance training, and we use a timeout chair for children who refuse to listen to a warning statement that they are being defiant. If they won't stay in the timeout chair, Then they go to a backup space. So they would go to another room where the therapist might go in with them. They might have a small room. You'll see a couple on these slides. There might be a small room built into a PCIT clinic with a half door where the child might go into the room for 1 minute plus 5 seconds of silence with the parent within a couple of feet of the child and in constant visual contact. So the other thing that is sometimes done is what's called a swoop and go, where if they won't stay in the timeout chair, the toys are taken out of the room, and the child then is left in a timeout until they agree to sit in that chair. But the timeout room is to simulate like going to a bedroom at home. Like if they had to, if you didn't listen to your parent, you had to go to your bedroom. And so the idea would be if you have a timeout in a chair, and if you don't listen, you go to the bedroom, and then you go back to the chair. So you spend 1 minute plus 5 seconds of silence in the bedroom, and then back to the chair. And this could go 3 or 4 times, could go 7 times, until the child agrees to sit in the timeout chair. So it's sort of an amped up consequence that if first you try the timeout chair, and then for serious escape defiance with timeout, then they get another consequence for that behavior. So the timeout chair is already controversial enough, right? Siegel and Bryson have told us that that's a really scary thing to put a child in a timeout chair. Well, now we're talking about using a timeout room like in the child's bedroom as a backup for that chair, and so now we have another issue. So the second concern they brought up is, could the PDI, which is the parent-directed interaction, the discipline component of the timeout sequence for children who were abused while being disciplined, could that actually be a timeout? Could it be a trauma trigger for those children? And could that whole timeout chair thing actually trigger the child to have a trauma experience? And could the timeout room cause children with trauma histories to experience decompensation, dissociation? And these are things that I take very, very seriously, these questions, these comments. And these are hard questions to answer at a SeaWorld resort, really hard. Because my children would like swim up and their hands, they say, my fingers are wrinkled, and you got prunes, are you almost done, that kind of stuff. And so I did my best at SeaWorld to respond to these questions, and then I began a journey to study it and to really understand it and to have better answers than what I was able to do at the time. So I hope I have a little bit better answers for you now. This whole idea of a backup room, this is what it would look like, sort of like a half door that you might see in a daycare, something like that, and into a smaller area. And so could the timeout sequence actually re-traumatize children who have been abused or neglected? And I get this. I do a lot of consult calls on PCIT across the world. I cannot tell you how many times I've had the question. So it comes up all the time. Everyone is worried that we are going to re-traumatize children with trauma histories, and I am worried that we could re-traumatize children with trauma histories. So I went to the literature, which is what we do when we're researchers, is that we go to the literature and we start studying things. And the first thing I wanted to do was to have a definition of re-traumatization. And re-traumatization, the definition that I found that I like, is it is a relapse into a state of trauma that is triggered by some subsequent event. And so it really could happen. There really could be re-traumatization if being carried to a timeout chair could spark that conditioning to being hurt when being carried or being hurt in a discipline scenario. So re-traumatization, I think, is something that we need to seriously think about when we're thinking about using the timeout procedure. This brought up my own re-traumatization, by the way, because I I am one of those child therapists that Tony was talking about, that I just love therapy and I love working with families and I love kids. And so very early in my career, I wrote an article. And in this article, what we were trying to do is trying to get away from the fact that in the beginning, way back in the beginning, this is like decades ago, behavioral parent training had a spank in it. Oh my gosh, does anybody remember this? Oh my. That if the child wouldn't stay in a timeout chair, they got a spank, and then they got put back in the timeout chair. I, as a true blue child therapist, was super uncomfortable with it. And so I started to develop other alternatives. And so I came up with this alternative where if the child wouldn't stay in a timeout chair, the caregiver would put them in a second chair and just hold them for 30 seconds and then put them back in the timeout chair. So I came up with this procedure, this 2-chair thing where we would try to see if you could, and we're talking about preschoolers, I'm not talking about 12-year-olds, we're talking about 3-year-olds, that the parent would hold them for 30 seconds and put them back in the chair. Well, as a young person just coming off my postdoc and submitting this article, I ended up in absolute tears. Coming home with my husband with the review in my hand of the article. At the time that I did the study, I was super worried. This is my son, Danny. I have my children in this presentation. I have my dog in the presentation. Because it was videotaped, I didn't want to put a bunch of Google images in, and then I thought, how boring would this be before lunch with no images? Oh my gosh, so you get my kids and my dog. But what I was really worried about at the time that PCIT had a spank in it was that this really cool, amazing, huge, effective treatment, that the PCIT, the good stuff, was going to get thrown out with the bathwater because the spank was so yucky, so distasteful, so aversive, went against the recommendations of APA and against the pediatrician recommendations. And I was afraid we're going to lose the whole program if we didn't develop another way to make timeout work for children who will not go to a timeout chair or stay in a timeout chair, which is all the cases that get referred for PCIT. So I came up with this little idea, then why don't we just try have the parent hold them and put them back in the chair. And this was the review that I got back from John Lutzker. And the review says, so if anybody's ever gotten a bad review, and those of you graduate students who might, if you're submitting your first articles, just go and read this review and it will help you. Because you'll be like, well, mine wasn't that bad. I can resubmit this thing, I got this. So wasn't as bad as Cheryl. So it was. The research, it says, some of the highlights, maybe I'm just going to get over my re-traumatization and read through it. I find this kind of research appalling. It's difficult to believe that at this stage of, maybe I shouldn't read it out loud. Or maybe I should. Tony, should I? I should, shouldn't I? I should write a narrative about it. So my attempt at a narrative, I can do it. Difficult to believe that at this stage of research and treatment, applied behavior analysis with children and others with serious disorders, some researchers still pursue aversive and unappealing techniques with little overall monitoring of the people that they train. And I hope that these researchers are otherwise good and kind people, and that they are capable of research that is of use to the child behavior therapy community. But I hope to never see this kind of research again. I'll just take a drink, I'm good. I'm okay. I'm okay. Right. So this has been going on in my career for decades, and it's so hard. When you read this, you might just say, Cheryl, why don't you just give up that whole PDI thing already, you know? Give up that discipline thing, give up that timeout thing, because it's not going anywhere. People don't like it. So I want to spend the rest of this time saying why I didn't just get rid of it, because it sure would be a whole lot easier for me in my career if I just did child-directed interaction. We just had some good positive behavior support going on, and we called it good. And I wouldn't have to deal with these controversies and the criticism. So let me tell you where I'm coming from. I go back to SeaWorld. At SeaWorld, I just felt it again. It's like, no, here we go again. That people don't understand the idea of setting limits with children. They don't believe in it. They don't get it. Maybe it's not right. I need to reconsider this, because I was really worried that we were going to throw the baby out with the bathwater again, and this time it would be over the use of the timeout room, which is currently in the protocol for PCIT, either a swoop and go or a timeout room for children who will not stay in timeout or go to timeout, or who won't stay in timeout, who escape from timeout. So then I start to ask myself, should we just throw this out? Should we just throw out the timeout for children with trauma histories? Should we just get rid of it? And ethically, I can't make myself do it. I know a lot of therapists will do that. They'll cherry pick out of PCIT and behavioral parent training programs and kind of take the parts they like and get rid of those distasteful parts and kind of do the positive parts. And I understand that. I personally can't do it. And the reason I can't do it is because I've done the research on CDI alone, the child-directed interaction alone, and we can't get the children's behavior to within normal limits with just the CDI. And once we add the second component, it's not like we get a little bit of change in these children. We get the children to change to within normal limits so that their behavior problems look like their peers if we dare to go to the second phase. So for me, knowing these data, it's hard for me to say, let's just throw out that distasteful thing, because I know how effective it is. So what happens if we don't do the timeout procedure? What if we don't go there and we just do the positive relationship building part? These children are at increased risk of school failure. You know they've been kicked out of daycares, right, when they get referred to PCIT. So where do you go from there when you're kicked out of Head Start? What does your future hold for you when you've been expelled from Head Start? You know, our children have been expelled from 3, 4, 5 Head Starts when they come into PCIT. So I know that if I just do CDI, I know I won't have them within normal limits, and they will continue to have school failures because of their severe problem behaviors. They're at increased risk of juvenile detention. They're at increased risk of a lost foster placement. For those who are in foster care, we get 60% of lost foster placements are due to behavior problems. And then we have less chance of successful reunification with the biological parent, and we have greater chance of future abuse. And so when I look at all of that, even though I get criticized terribly all the time for the PDI, I still say we've got to boldly go and help these children to actually have a chance to defeat the odds. The odds are against the children with trauma histories. So there is an assumption here on children with trauma histories, and the assumption is that timeout traumatizes children. And the first thing I want to do is I want to question that assumption. It's an assumption. It's not necessarily a fact that timeout traumatizes children. So I think we have to examine the evidence, and we have to use a trauma-informed approach for this. Here's what ethics mandates to us, is that a trauma-informed approach, if you look at SAMHSA and you look at what we're supposed to do as trauma-informed therapists, we're supposed to avoid re-traumatizing individuals. We are supposed to have safety first, and we're supposed to have a commitment to do no harm. And so a definition of a trauma-informed approach involves realizing the prevalence of trauma in our referral. So that means we actually have to ask the question. We actually have to assess it. We have to recognize how trauma affects all individuals involved with the program, organization, system, and we have to respond by putting this knowledge into practice, what we know. So I think it's helpful for us to take a trauma-informed approach with Timeout right now, and let's realize let's recognize, let's respond, and let's think about these trauma issues and time out. So in terms of trauma issues, we have to think about the definition of trauma. So listen to the title of this talk. Whenever my father, who's almost 90 years old, is here in Miami with me at the hotel, and he said, "What is the topic of your talk?" And I said, "Does Timeout traumatize children?" And he laughed out loud. He laughed out loud. He said, "Are you kidding? You're going to talk a whole hour about that?" Do you see? Because if you look at and I thought this was helpful that Dr. Manarino did this for us, is to look at what is trauma. And so events that involve actual or threatened death or serious injury or threat to the physical integrity of self or others. And we're talking about a 3-minute timeout in a chair. We're talking about a child sitting in a chair for 3 minutes. And so response to the event involves intense fear, helplessness, horror, or disorganized and agitated behavior. So I do worry that we throw that word around a lot, re-traumatizing children. Timeout is traumatizing to children. But I think we really need to know what trauma means whenever we're using a word like that. So these are the DSM-5 examples of traumatic events: exposure to war, physical assault, being kidnapped, disasters, and you presented the slide. I just want you to think about these things with respect to time out in a chair. I do. I just want you to kind of put that into a context here and think about my father at the hotel laughing out loud. He's like, "In my day, beat their butts." And so it's we just have to put this in a context, about where we're going with this. And could this be a trauma for children? Do they get traumatized by time out in a chair? It doesn't fit the definition of trauma, but could they be re-traumatized or triggered? Now that's a different thing. To me, that's a different thing. So I can't see the justification for timeout itself as a traumatic event, but you just have to wonder, could it actually then involve triggering? How many of you have actually coached a parent? You actually had a parent do a timeout in front of you, and you actually coached them through it. Let me see your hands. Okay. What do children actually do when they're being coached through a timeout? Oh my gosh, they scream. Thank you. Just holler it out for me. Go ahead. What do they do when you put a child with a typical history, no known history of trauma? What do they do when you put them in a timeout chair?
They scream. They cry.
They scream, they cry, they hit, they yell, "You're hurting me." They say, "Let me out. You're so mean." And so if somebody came by the outside of a room while this was happening, they certainly could think, you must be traumatizing children in that room, because it does sound like horrible, horrible things are happening in that room. So the question, children with trauma histories most certainly are going to scream, and they're going to cry, and they're going to kick, and they're going to fight. And so how do you determine if that is re-traumatization, if that is some sort of a regression, or some sort of how do you know if that's depersonalization? How do you know if that is a trauma response to the timeout? And I actually would love to pick Dr. Monterino's brain there and find out, how would we know the difference between screaming, crying, and hitting and a trauma reaction? It's very difficult to do that. So what I did is I went to the literature, and depersonalization is persistent or recurrent experiences of feeling detached from and as if one were an outside observer of one's mental processes or body, feeling as though one were in a dream, or feeling a sense of unreality, or moving like time is moving slowly. Or could the children be having derealization in timeout, like persistent or recurrent experiences of unreality of surroundings? Or is this typical frustration and anger at not getting their way? And so I think that we need to look a little bit at what would it look like if it was a bizarre or unusual response to timeout, and trying to separate out. If a child started to have some of this derealization or depersonalization, I would be extremely worried, and I would want to cease timeout procedures, because I would worry that this was triggering a trauma reaction in those children. But whenever I have a child with a trauma history, a foster child or a child with trauma history, and that child is screaming and crying and timeout, and I don't see that looking any different than our typically developing children, then I'm not so worried. But I think about it, and I think about it a lot, because I want to realize and respond and consider whether we could be doing harm with such an aversive and intensive procedure as coaching a parent to put a child in a timeout chair. So when we examine the definition of re-experiencing and intrusive symptoms, we start thinking about, is the child having recurrent and intrusive recollections of the event, or recurrent distressing dreams replaying the event? If these behaviors were coming out, I would want to cease and get consultation from trauma experts, and I would want to do something differently if I thought that the going through a discipline procedure was causing the child to have dissociation, flashbacks, intense psychological distress, intense physiological reactivity, or marked physiological reactions to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble. So a parent picking up a child and putting them in a timeout chair, so it certainly could resemble what happened to a child who had been physically abused. And so I think we want to be aware of when would we be quite worried that perhaps some kind of trauma reaction was going on, as opposed to the usual behavior problems you see in a timeout. So I think it's interesting to think about, if we are risking re-traumatizing children, at what point is the risk occurring? So is the problem that we shouldn't give commands to children? You think about compliance training. Is it okay to give a command? So if you really have concerns about this, at what point do we have the big concerns? We have to give commands to children, right? So maybe compliance training itself is okay. What about a warning statement about the fact that if you don't put on your coat, you'll have to sit on a timeout chair? Is that something we should be seriously worried about, giving a warning statement about timeout? What about sitting on the timeout chair? Siegel and Bryson would say we better be worried about that, because issues are happening in the brain that are trauma issues that are going on, that are the same parts of the brain that children experience when they have physical pain and physical abuse. And so maybe we shouldn't be putting them in a timeout chair. And is the biggest issue then perhaps the backup to the timeout chair for when children won't stay and they have to go to their bedroom before they go back to the timeout chair? Is that the biggest issue? And is that only an issue for children with a known history of being locked in a closet or being neglected and left alone for long periods of time? So these are the things I think about, like, all right, if there is the potential of re-traumatizing, where would that exactly happen, and how could we prevent that from occurring? What's done in PCIT is that very specific guidelines have been placed about if you're going to use a backup space to the timeout chair for escape, that place has to be a certain size, it has to be well lit, the parent has to be in visual contact with the child so they don't feel like they've been placed there and left, and it's done for a short period of time. There's not any locks in this place, it has to be well lit. And so all these guidelines have had to be placed out in order to have community agencies to be able to have a PCIT program with fidelity so that you can handle the escape from timeout, which most certainly will happen. If you have a PCIT program, you will probably have escape on the very first case of the PCIT program that you have. And the fact that children will not stay in a timeout chair puts them at risk for expulsion from Head Start and expulsion from suspension from kindergarten and things like that, because timeout is used a lot in school settings. What I know about the discipline component, and the reason that I feel more comfortable about moving forward, is that I know a learning curve occurs. And parents don't know this. Foster parents don't know this. So a lot of our concerns are actually brought to us by a foster parent or a parent who says, I'm worried about re-traumatizing my child who has had a really tough history so far. And they see that first discipline coaching session, which is pretty horrendous. When you have your first discipline coaching session, the children are screaming and crying, and they are in incredible distress. They're very angry. And so if you watch that first session, you would say, no one should ever use timeout with a child with a trauma history based on that first discipline coaching session. But what I know that individuals who don't do a lot of this don't know necessarily is that there is a fast, intensive learning curve, so that in the first discipline coaching, you have a long timeout and a lot of back and forths, and then in the second one, it goes down, and then the third one goes down. And if anybody has ever done PCIT, you have a really tough first PDI coaching, and sometimes you have a difficult second PDI coaching, and then you can't get the child to time out again in the third or the fourth or the fifth or the sixth. So it's amazing to think that a child who is completely dysregulated, has been expelled from 4 daycares, has this horrendous trauma history. When asked out of 10 things, how many things would your child comply with throughout the day, the parent says 0. And 2 weeks later, the child is 100% compliant in the clinic. 2 hours later, 2 hours of therapy later, the child is 100% compliant in the clinic. And 5 sessions after that, their child behavior checklist and their iBird child behavior inventory come to within normal limits. 5 hours later, 5 therapy hours later, the child's behavior comes to within normal limits. But I know that, and that's why I can persist, even though there's a lot of criticism and a lot of concerns and a lot of people with myths about what's going on. I know that what's going to happen is a completely dysregulated child in 2 weeks will be a regulated child. And you'll look at that child and you'll think that child has no self-control. That child is damaged. That child cannot self-regulate. That child cannot get it under control. And then 2 weeks later, the parent will say, please pick up that toy. And they'll be like, okay, Mom. And you're like, whoa, like 2 weeks ago, you hit your mother, you screamed, we went through a 30-minute timeout over this, and now you're choosing to make a good choice and to show respect for your caregiver. So if I didn't know about the learning curve and the fact that our goal in PCIT is to have the family so that they hardly ever have to use a timeout, that we use it in the beginning, and then our goal is to get rid of it and very seldom have to use it, I would be really, really more concerned as well. The other thing, I think something that you should think about in terms of, I'm changing my attitude towards this whole timeout thing. In the beginning, at SeaWorld and at other places, which John Lutzker was even earlier than SeaWorld, my attitude has been one of this, where I would get punch with the criticism, and I would be falling back on my heels, and I would be saying, we're not hurting kids, I promise we're not hurting kids, and I had this real defensive posture as I was getting so attacked about the use of a timeout procedure. I think now that I've done a lot more study and a lot more understanding, rather than being defensive, I promise we're not hurting anybody, I promise we're being ethical, we're not being unethical like that. I think I'm moving towards standing up straight and saying it's not that we're not hurting children, we're treating children. Like, it's not that it's not doing harm, it's that it's actually the thing that gets them better. And so I'm realizing now that I have to stand up and say, my goodness, look what we're doing here. That it is the therapy. It's not that this is a therapy that hurts children. It is the therapy that makes children better. And so here's where I'm coming at from that. We have studies across cultures. You can look at studies in India and studies in all different cultures. And they will tell you that the best type of parenting, if you want to have healthy mental health outcomes in children, is authoritative parenting. Across the board. Would everybody agree with that? Authoritative parenting leads to good, healthy outcomes in children. So should traumatized children then be denied the benefits of authoritative parenting because we're scared that we might re-traumatize? So that means we can't set limits. If you can't put them in a timeout chair, you can't set limits. And so that is a scary thought to me. That's like, oh, you have a trauma history, then you don't get to have the good stuff. You don't get to have a treatment that actually works because we might have a chance of triggering some traumatic response. Even though we don't have any evidence, people are worried about that, theoretically worried about it. And I also think that emotion regulation is a huge issue in trauma, and that PDI teaches it and teaches it fast. We're talking in 2 sessions, 3 sessions, the children will make good choices. When we set a rule about no hitting, we'll have a child who's hitting 15 times a day. And you'll put in a no hurting house rule, and the child will go like this and start to hit, and they'll put their hand down because they see the timeout chair. And I believe that it is the fence and the structure that leads to emotion regulation. If there was not a timeout chair available, the child would just hit 15 times a day because nothing's going to happen. I'll just keep hitting. And they're going to get kicked out of schools because they're just going to attack the teachers because nothing is going to happen. There will be no negative consequences. There's no offense. And I have this vision of children with disruptive behavior like Tasmanian devils, like zzz, like a tornado, like, zzz, like this. And I think that discipline is like this fence or these mountains that diffuse the tornado, that they keep running up against the fence, and then the tornado starts to come down and they start to be able to regulate and to have good choices. So there's where my dog comes in, because something that I didn't realize early in my career is that timeout could actually enhance the parent-child bond. I never would have thought this, all right, until I've done a lot of PDI. But could timeout actually improve attachment in relationships? Could timeout actually make a parent-child relationship better? In order to think about that, you have to look at my cute little dog, Diamond. That's what he really looks like on the right. But what if he looked like the dog on the left? How easy is it to bond and have a positive attachment with a dog who bites you, snarls at you, attacks you? You're scared to turn your back because they'll jump up and grab your neck. It's hard to be positive. It's hard to feel bonded. It's hard to have a positive relationship when you have a child in the home who is so dangerous and scary that they cause a lot of anguish. So one of the things to think about is rather than it's certainly possible that timeout triggers trauma. It's certainly possible. But is that necessarily a bad thing? I'm going to ask you that question. Is that a horrible thing? If putting a child in a timeout chair or setting limits in general, if that triggers trauma, is that a terrible thing? Because what is it about distress that's resulting from triggering anxiety associated with harsh parenting in the past? Yes, there could be some distress about that. But what is the most effective treatment if there are triggers for trauma about physical discipline, harsh physical discipline? The best treatment is actually exposure-based. And so one thing I just want to pose to you, it's a really radical idea, but could the exposure to the limits and the exposure to the timeout process, could it actually be a therapeutic in and of itself, the exposure that happens in coaching families through timeout procedures? So you think about the trauma narrative. In PDI and in behavioral parent training, we are actually doing in vivo exposure to limit setting. If limit setting is what's causing the trigger, if that's what's getting them to remember harsh discipline practices in the past, could we then expose them to limit setting in a systematic and therapeutic way that would be carefully done so that they could have gradual exposure to it, and could that exposure in and of itself be therapeutic? So I believe that PDI does provide exposure to trauma triggers, And I believe that PDI provides a safe and consistent, predictable exposure to limit setting. Rather than this happening in the home when the parent's trying to cook spaghetti and the dog is barking and 3 other children are present and they're trying to stick that child in a timeout chair, we have a safe environment. We have a supervisor present. We have a very carefully plotted room. And all of this exposure can happen in a very controlled setting so that the child can have exposure to discipline scenarios. In our discipline program, we start with Mr. Bear. So it really is systematic that we start by the role-playing timeout with a stuffed animal going to a timeout chair, and the child can then learn about the rules of timeout. What tends to happen in families is that timeout gets explained in the middle of a red-faced screaming tantrum is when they explain timeout to a child. We want the children to know the rules of timeout, to role-play it, to understand it, particularly the backup space, that the caregiver is going to be standing right here. They will not leave. They'll be right there waiting for you. You'll be in there for 1 minute, and then you'll come back to the timeout chair. In PDI, we have a staircase of gradual expectation increases. So what happens with children who have hundreds of misbehaviors a day is that it's incredibly difficult to do the effective part of this fence around the Tasmanian devil. You know what parents will say to me? They'll say, where can I buy a chair like that one? Did you get that on Amazon, that timeout chair? They believe that it is the chair, that physical chair, is the reason that the children are well behaved is because of that chair. And so it's not the chair. The reason the children are well behaved in our clinic is because of the consistency, the predictability, and the follow through. So what happens in the use of timeout in a typical family is you're being bad, you go to timeout. Stop that, you're going to timeout. Last straw, I've had it, go to timeout. And think about if you're a child with a trauma history. Think about how frightening that would be if you have a history of being hurt during discipline scenarios. The last straw, the screaming parent who's out of control, that could be very frightening. So what we do is we gradually expose the caregiver and the child to increased expectations. And in the first step of PCIT and the PDI, we only work on play commands. The child is taught to put the eyes on Mr. Potato Head. We'd spend a week on this. Put the eyes on Mr. Potato Head for a week, put the block on top of the block, take the car, push it down the track. And what we're trying to do is get the children to enjoy listening, to feel good about compliance for the first week, and to really set them up for how, there's the timeout chair explaining the rules, Mr. Bear, we do this for a week. So we work our way gradually to greater consistency throughout the day. We go to 2 to 4 real-life commands once they've mastered the first step of play commands, and then we move on to all-day commands. And once we have a compliant child, only then do we start a stop rule where timeout would be used for a stop rule, usually no hurting anyone. At the end of PCIT, the overwhelming majority of cases, a child goes to timeout for only 2 behaviors. One behavior is they have disobeyed a warning statement. If you don't give that toy back to your sister, you'll have to sit on a timeout chair. So if they disobeyed a warning statement, they'd have to go to timeout. And the second thing they'd go to timeout for is hurting someone. We do not put children in timeout for being bad. You screamed, you go to timeout. You broke the vase, you go to timeout. You did a fart noise, you go to timeout. We keep it very consistent so that there's only 2 things, and those are the 2 big things, is getting children to be respectful and listen, and getting them not to hurt anyone. So we work our way up a staircase where only when they're successful at a stair do they move on to the next stair. So I believe this is systematic desensitization and systematic exposure to limit setting and systematic exposure to the timeout procedure. I have an extinction paradigm here. So let's imagine that we have re-triggering going on. And let's say that the unconditioned stimulus is yelling and hitting, and that the unconditioned response is fear, anger, and agitation. And let's say this gets conditioned to any setting limits or saying no to a child. And then let's say that any time a parent says no, that they have fear, anxiety, and agitation. I totally believe that this is what happens in the case of children with real severe trauma histories with discipline. So what are we doing then in PCIT is that we're changing the condition stimulus so it no longer causes the condition response, and we're doing it by repeated trials with very safe and effective discipline procedures that limit setting that always end, they're very safely supervised, and they always end with positive relationship building at the end of the time. So it ends on a very positive note. Here's the trick, here's the kicker, and I just thought it was fascinating in the previous presentation when you talked about the therapists having trauma histories. The caregivers have trauma histories and therapists have trauma histories. And so the parents also get triggered in discipline scenarios. So when they go to set a limit with their child and their child then acts like the abuser in an intimate partner violence situation, the caregiver throws up their hands and they drop the command and they negatively reinforce the child because of their own trauma histories. I believe that the caregivers are also going through this extinction paradigm, getting comfortable setting limits with their children, getting comfortable with the idea that this can end in a safe and appropriate manner. If you're interested in this, we did write a chapter on this, and this is a reading that you might want to see. And it's going back to the question of why would the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, why would SAMHSA support PCIT with trauma populations? The answer is that it works. And SAMHSA recognizes it works. The RCTs are obvious that it's working. And when you look at the Chaffin study, Mark Chaffin studied the ultimate issue question. The worst case of re-traumatization would be if a child gets hit again by a parent. And PCIT has been shown to decrease recidivism of physical abuse. So let's think about what is an evidence-based approach to helping parents safely. If you can't safely manage your child with a safe approach, they're going to hit their child. They're going to hurt their child because they're going to lose their temper. They don't know how to manage a child who's escalating out of control. So I think that we've got some trauma-informed aspects going on when we do a discipline procedure like a PDI or other timeout procedures in behavioral parent training. We use timeout as a last resort. We have already done all the relationship building before we put it in. We have a very systematic rollout of our expectations, and we use timeout very infrequently. If a child is getting timeout more than once or twice a day, we're going down the staircase and we're going to decrease the expectations so that they never receive too many timeouts and that wouldn't be going on. And we set up situations where we set up as much safety and as much control for the child as possible. And we believe that that kind of control in discipline situations is extremely beneficial to children with trauma histories to help with their anxiety related to discipline. To have a warning statement before any timeout is done, the warning statement gives the child control over whether they receive a consequence or not. And then when you look at Urquiza's data and you look at some of the data that we've had in Wisconsin, we've done foster parent training workshops. What's interesting in those data is that the internalizing aspects of the CBCL, they decrease as well as the externalizing scale of the CBCL. If we were re-traumatizing children, then the CBCL internalizing should be escalating over time. And instead, when you go into PDI, the internalizing starts to come down, and we're getting more and more evidence that the anxiety is coming down. So when I asked the question, does timeout traumatize children? Yes, Dad, I did spend an entire hour answering the question, but I would say no. And I actually think that timeout decreases trauma symptoms in children because it provides structure, it provides limits, it gives them a chance to regulate, it teaches them regulation, and I think that those all are very healthy things for children with trauma histories. So on a personal note, for all of you therapists out there who are fighting the hard fight with other therapists who are questioning what you're doing, why you are doing it, I would say that for me in my career, it's always been that doing the right thing is sometimes the hardest thing. And so until I find something more effective that can get children's behavior to within normal limits, I'm going to keep using timeout, and I hope that you will have a positive attitude toward it as well. So thank you all very much.
What age range would you say that timeout is appropriate?
In the program that we use, the timeout is appropriate. We joke about it, that it starts at 24 months, 2 years, and it goes up to 6 years, 11 months, and 29 days. At the age of 7 years, we have very big difficulty making timeout work for 7-year-olds. So we're talking about mostly a preschool approach to helping preschoolers to handle their tempers and to be able to respect their caregivers. A lot of it has to do with whether you can pick the child up. So the parent has to be able to carry them to a timeout chair. And if they cannot carry the child to a timeout chair, then the procedure becomes a lot less powerful at that point. That's a good question. Yes, and or you should choose. Yeah, you got the microphone.
Hi.
Hello.
Do you have any suggestions on how to assist those parents who aren't able to effectively set limits with their children because of their own traumatic experiences?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, too. I really think that whole relationship enhancement phase builds trust between the therapist. It always comes down to a relationship between the therapist and the caregiver. And I think that by building trust in the process and teaching them the effects of the positive skills and the use of ignore and redirect on children's disruptive behavior, I think they start to develop trust in you, and then you're kind of talking about the discipline phase throughout. But I think saying, I'll be there with you, I will coach you through it, I will tell you what to say and tell you what to do. You'll memorize a script. You'll say the words the same way every single time, and I will help you. I just think that there's something about that. They know it's going to be a hard session. They know it's going to be challenging, but I'm not sending them home to do it on their own. I'm saying I'll be with you every step of the way. Yeah.
Is there any work being done to talk about an adaptation of this sort of program for older teenagers? Like,
Not that I know of. I think that if you look at some of the parent-adolescent conflict work and some of the work by Jim Alexander, you still get the same 2 phases. You have a relationship building phase that often involves communication skills training, and then there's some sort of limit setting stage. And so you can see that same idea with adolescents, but I have not seen this type of a coaching approach where the therapist has a Bluetooth and you're behind a mirror and you're helping the parent on what to say and what to do. I haven't seen that with the adolescents, but I do think the 2 phases are critical because they match up to authoritative parenting. And authoritative parenting, I really believe, is the key.
Hi.
Hi.
Does this program also include with working with children with autism? And if so, have you seen the same kind of results?
Well, it's interesting that you say that because I think of my career like in decades. And this next decade, I think, is going to be autism related. Because we have pilot studies now in which the children's disruptive behavior is coming to within normal limits with children who have language and are on the high functioning end of the autism spectrum. And when I started my career, if a child on the spectrum got referred, you referred it out because the program is relationship based. We don't have any sticker charts. We don't have any edibles. It's all based on parental attention. You give attention for what you want. You take away attention. Timeout is a removal of attention. And so we originally thought that if it was a child on the spectrum, you refer it out. And now the data are compelling. And now I really wanted, I'm working on an RCT application right now to see how far can we go? And could we add a 3rd stage to this model? Similar to the bravery-directed interaction stage of an anxiety, could we add a social and language stage that would allow us to do a lot of the work that you would do with children on the spectrum, a social skills training phase? Yeah.
Hi. In terms of the amount of time that a child should be in timeout,
Yes.
I have heard in the past that like is according to their age. Like if it's a 2-year-old, so it would be 2 minutes that he's allowed to be in the chair. Is that correct, or would that be, something
I think that is
optional?
an excellent rule of thumb for typically developing children. But if you have a child with ADHD or disruptive behavior, and they're 5 years old, 5 minutes is too long. So we use across the board a 3-minute timeout, and we have an evidence base for a 3-minute timeout. We tried a 1-minute timeout, and it's not long enough. At 1 minute, when the caregiver goes over to the preschooler and says, "Are you ready to put the eyes on Mr. Potato Head?" they say no. But at 3 minutes, they will say yes. But if you go to 4 minutes and 5 minutes, it's diminishing returns, and the child has a greater likelihood of escape. I made my career on escape from timeout. So I got tenure on escape from timeout. So many articles on escape from timeout. But as you leave the child in timeout longer and longer periods of time, then you increase that probability. So I think a 3-minute timeout's a good rule of thumb with children with disruptive behavior. But some of the 2-year-olds might need it a little shorter. Yeah.
So it seems like it could be possible to use this claim empirically by just having parents fill out like trauma symptom checklist every week. If the symptoms don't go up when you transition to PCIT, that would be pretty strong evidence that this isn't happening.
Yeah, can I steal that? Because I think that'd be a great study. Yeah, we need to do it. We've done it with the CBCL, and we showed that the internalizing symptoms on the CBCL go down. But we should go right at it. We should go directly at it, because if we're not getting nightmares and we're not getting flashbacks and that sort of thing, then we're not getting re-traumatization. So that would even be better. I wouldn't have to do a whole hour. I would just put that slide up and we could call it done. That's a good one. Okay. Are we done? Can I let them eat? Thank you all so much. Let's go to lunch.